Hi there, my name's Isha and welcome on board here for another episode of Higher Life TV, where I take concepts that are considered esoteric, spiritual or new agey and break them down into really simple insights and practical tools that you can use to go out and start creating a really abundant and fulfilling life. Now, before I get started on the topic of this episode, which is what is shame and how does shame work in our life and how can we really use shame as a way to energize our life purpose, to go out there and manifest our life purpose. And that might seem like a weird kind of contradiction, and we all have this sense that shame is something that isn't really a great thing in our life. It's really uncomfortable. It really holds us back. So how can this actually be a powerful ally in helping us to live an abundant and fulfilling life? And in today's lesson, I'm just going to touch on that and give you kind of a top line understanding of how shame works in your life. But before I do that, I just want to really hone in on the two life goals that this work is helping you to achieve. I mentioned them earlier, like an abundant life. When I'm working with clients and in my own life, what I'm really looking for is how can I live in a really abundant way and how can I live in a really fulfilling way? And there's a lot of miscommunication about what these two concepts are, abundance and fulfillment. And, I will follow on from these episodes with an episode about each of those. But the biggest, I think, misconception is that abundance means, material wealth, that you're rich. And when you're rich, then you can go out and do whatever you want. And that means that your life is abundant. And abundance doesn't really mean that. It really essentially means that you feel fully supported, nourished, and nurtured by life. It's a very different thing. And, in our more primitive brains, we kind of have this idea that we need money to achieve those goals, to have this kind of life. And the second one is fulfillment. Again, we have a kind of misconception that fulfillment is when we feel a certain way about our lives, that we have this hole and that hole will be gone and we will feel a sense of contentment. And it's not exactly right. Fulfillment really means that you have a life purpose or a soul purpose and you go out there and fulfill that purpose. You live up to it, you manifest it by using your unique gifts, your creativity. And I call this a creative fulfillment. And shame is one of the most important portals or doorways into achieving these two life goals. So let's start with what is shame. And I know that shame, the concept of shame has become, quite a widely discussed topic, especially after the work of Brené Brown, who focuses or is a researcher, I believe, on the topic of shame. But what I want to do is just give you a perspective on shame that I use in the work that I do and through my own personal transformation. Shame is a really uncomfortable physiological feeling that you have. It's a sensation. That's the first thing about shame. You feel it physically as a sensation in your body. And in some fields such as psychology, we call this a triggered self. You have this kind of switch that goes off in your body and you suddenly feel all these really sticky and uncomfortable feelings that feel like fear, feel like rage, feel like numbness. There's a whole range of sensations and physical experiences that make up this feeling of shame. So essentially, how shame differs from other types of uncomfortable feelings, such as momentary anger, resentment, rage, is that it is a very deep and powerful experience. When we are in a place of shame, it takes over, almost like like a demon of sorts. It's almost like this demon that takes over our body and we actually really can't think and function very well. So it is incredibly powerful. Why is it powerful? What makes shame so powerful? Well, shame is an experience that is a time in our life. We build shame in our system when our soul has been diminished in some sort of way. Now, I might have an interaction with somebody who I care about or somebody that I don't care about and have, a feeling of anger or frustration because of something they do. But I can get over that quite quickly. I can notice, all right, I'm frustrated. I may or may not make a decision and I'll move on, but it won't affect me physiologically for very long. It'll come and go. Shame happens when I have an interaction with someone and I suddenly feel a wave, or I feel my whole physiology, my being my being shifts out of being comfortable or okay to this severely uncomfortable place where I feel threatened. I really feel threatened in this primal way, and my reaction is to flee the situation or fight the situation. Now I really want to touch on that shame is in our very being, and the reason why that is that when you are a child or very young, some interaction has happened, usually in the family system or in the school system, where your being, the way that you are, your very being has been diminished by another person or by a situation. Your soul has been abused in some way or another. And that sounds really strong, but it's really the truth. We feel shame as a human being when our soul self, our being self, has been diminished by another person or by a situation. We've been abused at that level of soul, and it wounds us, and we develop within us a wounded self, a truly wounded self at the level of soul. And what actually happens then is this wounded self, which I talked about last week in the last few episodes about our ego and how does our ego work in the world. And the one key learning that I delivered there was that we have a healthy ego and a dysfunctional ego. And the source of our dysfunctional ego, what fuels our dysfunctional ego, is this shame. So to put it very simply, I'm going to take an example of how shame happens. You're born into a family, and your authentic self or your soul self is a very, let's say, a very creative, very poetic, very, let's say sensitive. You're very sensitive to the poetry of life and the magic of life, and you feel things very strongly. But you grow up in a family where there is a belief system that it is emotions are a sign of weakness. Showing emotions, expressing emotions are a sign of weakness, and that somehow your very being, the way that you are born, your gifts, the beauty that you have to offer the world doesn't fit in this family system. And through subtle and not so subtle ways, that message gets delivered to you. Why are you always so sensitive? Why do you always have to make such a drama about things? Why are you bad in this way? And what's actually happening there is that your very being, your very, your soul self is being diminished through these actions, through these experience of being in a family that doesn't understand who you are at your soul self. And that wounding starts to happen. You start to feel really uncomfortable in your being, right? In your body, in your sensory system, because you're having these horrible, uncomfortable feelings of being made to feel bad about who you are. Now, the issue with shame is that we're very uneducated around how this happens. So a lot of the time, shame happens in perfectly happy, ordinary families and in perfectly happy, ordinary circumstances where the adult or the person who is delivering the shame comment doesn't really understand that they're doing that. They might be actually wanting to address a particular behavior. Maybe you've had a tantrum, and instead of saying, look, I don't think that responding in that way is the best way, they're like, why are you so sensitive? Why are you such a drama queen? Right? They're making it about you, the person, and not about the behavior, that you are not responding in a skillful way. Now, to add to this, adults often forget what it's like to be a baby or a toddler or a child and have unrealistic expectations about how a child should respond in a certain situation. So a child may be having a perfectly natural response, such as a tantrum, to being overtired, hungry, and in a busy supermarket, and the parent will not take that into account and start, diminishing the child. Why do you always have to be so difficult? Why are you making mummy's life so hard, or daddy's life? Now, this can happen in a school environment, where a child may not be understanding a lesson very well, and a teacher may make a comment such as, you've always been the slow one in the class, or why are you so stupid? Now, I know it sounds terrible, but we do say these things unconsciously to each other and to people without realizing that we're not addressing the behavior, we're diminishing the person. And we live in a culture in which this happens a lot, I think. humans aren't very well educated on how shame gets created in each other, and so we are all walking around with, these really strong shame bodies, or as I think Eckhart Tolle refers to it, is the pain body. The shame that we're carrying around from all these little incidences over our lifetime, where our way of being, the way that we give to the world, has been made small or wrong in some sort of way. So you can understand that if who you are at your soul level, your most powerful self, has been abused in some sort of way, especially if it's been abused in really, horrible ways, such as sexual abuse, physical abuse, or psychological abuse, that the soul itself becomes wounded. And this is really important, because if you've been following me, you'll understand that in order to be able to create a truly abundant and fulfilling life, your soul actually has to be in the driver's seat of your life. You have to trust your soul. You have to worship your soul. You have to see your soul as sacred. And if your soul is also the place where you're carrying this huge wound, this shame, it's very scary. You start to become more aligned with your soul, and all these really difficult, horrible sensations keep coming up, and you're like, what is that about? I don't want to feel those things. And bang, your ego steps in, and your ego says, that's okay. You don't have to feel all these things. I'm going to defend you, protect you, help you escape any situations, people, or events that are going to trigger this shame in you. I'm going to protect you from feeling this shame again. And here we have the dysfunctional ego at its best, right? And that is why the dysfunctional ego gets shaped from baby through to adulthood, because, these kind of patterns of diminishing, this diminishing way of being in a family system, or a school system, or a cultural system, or a gender system, doesn't happen once. It often happens repeatedly throughout your whole life, to the point where you become so used to that diminished version of yourself that you see it as who you are. And then your dysfunctional ego becomes who you think you are, yourself, your identity, and you go about interacting with everything that is happening in your life from this wounded soul self, this dysfunctional ego, and your life then starts to reflect this dysfunctional version of you as your true self. So it's a cycle. So the only way actually to transcend, to transform this wounded soul self into a whole, healthy, functional self is, of course, to address the shame, to work with the shame, to understand the shame. And when I'm saying that, I mean, you need to actually go in and understand, what is this shame self? What is this version of me, this wounded self that feels all this shame? What has she or he been told about herself that believes that she is no longer valuable? And you really need to use that shame experience as your doorway in to healing and bringing your soul into recovery. And that is not, a simple path by any means. And that is why we have had, Buddhism and Taoism and meditation and, all these spiritual practices that help us to be able to be strong enough, spiritually resilient enough to be able to sit with our shame feelings or our triggered selves long enough so that we can actually get to know them, start to dialogue with them, and start to unravel, this contraction or these diminished beliefs that we have about ourselves. And of course, Western psychology has been hugely beneficial in giving us the tools and strategies to be able to identify our wounded self and to start supporting that wounded self to heal and feel healthy and well in the world. So I really hope that today, I really went through that quickly because there's so much involved in understanding how shame gets created, in understanding how shame manipulates your ego to act in very dysfunctional ways, and understanding how to meet, greet, and form a positive and loving relationship with your shame so that you can, through this positive, loving relationship, transform your shame into personal power. And I'm going to touch on that in the next lesson, because essentially the reason why you don't feel powerful in your life and why you are not powerful in your life is that shame aspect of you is holding all your personal power in a kind of prison. So we need to be able to release that, and that is a form of alchemy. We understand that alchemy is transforming lead into gold. But in terms of spiritual transformation or personal transformation, alchemy refers to transforming the lead, the shame in your life, in your psyche, in your soul self, into creativity, love, power, all those positive attributes. And the reason why shame is so powerful, and I touched on it, is that your gifts, the superpowers that you're born with, your magic, your gifts, are also the same attributes that have been shamed, right? So what you have to offer the world, what your service will be, what your soul purpose will be, you were born with that inherently in your being, the way that you are. Your very being radiates your soul purpose. So if that part of you has been diminished from birth, it has been criticized, it has been belittled, it has been abused in any sort of way, you can see how you are not in touch with your gifts. You do not trust your gifts. You do not want to live from your gifts, because the minute that you start stepping into your gifts and your presence, all that triggered stuff comes up and you feel severely uncomfortable, and that just doesn't make sense to the logical mind. The logical mind is not going to walk further deeper into what causes so much pain, but that is essentially exactly what you need to do. And that is why you have people like me in the world who have done that for themselves. Everything I'm teaching to you now, I've done myself, and the reason why I'm teaching it to you or sharing it with you is because I personally experienced this, and I feel that it's valuable for people out there to be able to do for themselves. I haven't followed a book, a teacher, an ideology. I of course follow lots of different people and learn from them, but essentially this is a process I've gone through myself. Life alchemy, transforming myself by transforming the lead, the shame in my life, into wisdom and insights, and being of service to others, living my life purpose. And I absolutely want that for you. So I really hope that this lesson has been insightful, that you've learned a bit about shame and how it works in your life and what you can do to work more powerfully with it. If you want help working through your shame, you can always contact me by visiting my website, www.isharopatcoach.com. This was an especially long lesson, so I hope you stayed with me till the end. Until next time, take care and love life.